Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the cryptoverse. Today we're going to talk about Bitcoin, but in reference to the upcoming election in the United States. So if you guys like the content, please subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the Telegram channel in the description below. Now, I covered a lot of these charts on a live stream, but I wanted to make a dedicated video on it so that I could refer people to these charts in the future. Now, I was starting to make a lot of these charts myself, like I do for the rest of the channel, but I recognize that with traditional markets, a lot of this stuff has already been analyzed, and there's no sense for me to really reinvent the wheel. So what I've done is I've put a few charts on here. We can talk about them. We're going to look to see what Bitcoin has done historically speaking, in lieu of an election, a presidential election, and try to figure out what we could expect over the coming weeks. So go ahead and subscribe to the channel, and let's go ahead and jump in. So this chart here is by Strategic Research Partners. It shows, the S&P, the price performance of the S&P during presidential election years. Okay, and you can see one of the key takeaways from this is that in the day and week following the election, not every time, but on average, there's a slight dip in the markets. And you guys have probably heard me say many times that, in lieu of stock prices, there's a good chance that stocks can dip around election time. But then in the grand scheme, it's just a blip, right? It's nothing to write home about. It's nothing to even get out of bed for in terms of, worrying about these potential short-term moves. It's just business as usual. You can see that on average, one day after the election, no matter whether the incumbent party won or lost, there tended to be a slight retracement on average in stocks. Of course, there could be some election years where it went up, some where it went down. I'm sure the statistical significance of this is not very high. But just in general, on average, you can see it was approximately a 1% to a half to a 1% loss averaged over election years from 1936 to 2017. So then we look at 1 week after, and we can see that yet again, no matter whether the incumbent won or the incumbent lost, it was approximately a 1% pullback for that week. And then a month later, on average, if the incumbent had won, the market was doing slightly worse, and if the incumbent had lost, it was doing slightly above zero, right around zero. However, this trend changes the further out you get. For instance, 6 months after the election, if the incumbent had won, then on average, stocks were doing a little bit better than if the incumbent lost. And you can see this is even more pronounced 1 year later, where if the incumbent won, the stock market was up between 5 and 6% on average, compared to with the incumbent losing, only up maybe between 2 and 3% on average. Okay, so you can kind of see that leading into the election, return on investment in, say, the S&P, the way, the performance of the S&P tends to decrease going into an election, the months leading up to it. Right after the election, there does tend to be a dip in stock prices on average, and it makes sense because there's uncertainty. People are markets just generally don't like change or the idea of change, and so this can cause people to become a little bit more hesitant on stocks. And I mean, of course, many of you probably know people that are waiting until after the election to invest a token amount of money because they just want some of that volatility to go down. Now, if you look at presidential election years throughout history, if you look at, say, all presidential election years, on average, stocks are up around 11%, bonds are up around 5.5%. If the incumbent president wins, then historically speaking, stocks are up 13%. Okay, whereas if a new president is elected, they're up approximately 9%. So I thought this was interesting as well, and you can see that bonds generally are a little bit reversed essentially. So bonds are down more during years when the incumbent president wins compared to say a new president. And if you look at just in general over the course of the last 100 years or so, no matter whether it was a Republican president or a Democratic president, the stock market was generally trending upwards. There were obvious cases where it wasn't trending up. I mean, we all know about the 2008 financial crisis that sent stocks tumbling. And by the way, I think this financial crisis has actually caused a lot of recency bias, and people think that, okay, well, it happened it happened 12 years ago. It's kind of crazy to think that was 12 years ago, but it happened 12 years ago. Therefore, something like this has to happen again because of what's going on in the economy. And we've always said on this channel, let's stick to the data because the data does not suggest like something like that has to happen. Okay, it just simply does not necessarily have to happen, and this is not going to be a sensationalist type thing where every single year we're going to predict a major crash or something. Because eventually, right, if you predict it every year, eventually you'll be right, and then you take credit for it. But then you can spend the next 10 years predicting it again, and it just doesn't happen. So a lot of the the doomsdayers essentially were saying crash, crash, crash for years. We get a pullback in March. We're already back up and continuing to cruise on. I know it might not make a whole lot of sense. It might seem irrational to you, but that's just where we are right now. You could obviously write it off to all the printing governments have been doing, which is probably an actually valid reason to say why the stock market is doing as well as it is. But at the end of the day, things like 40% drops in stocks over a few week period just don't happen that often. And so because we saw one in March, it was a great time to take advantage of that. And I think it's a little bit too optimistic for people that are waiting on the sidelines to think that there necessarily has to be another 30 to 40% drop. Because my response to you is, well, where were you last time when it happened, right? Where were you last time? I mean, if you look at the average annual stock market, and we will get into how this relates to Bitcoin if you're wondering, if you look at the general annual stock market return during election years, you can see that in general, it does pretty well, right? Stocks do pretty well during election years. There were some outliers. Roosevelt, Hoover, -8. Roosevelt in 1940, -10 almost. And then the next negative was all the way down in 2000, Bush versus Gore, -9%. And then in 2008, Obama versus McCain during the financial crisis, of course, -37%. But most of the time during election years, we actually do see a pretty good return on stocks. And if you look under these various scenarios, so there's 6 different 6 different outcomes, likely outcome or potential outcomes with the election, right? So there's a Republican sweep, a Democratic sweep, a Republican president with a split Congress, a Republican president with a Democratic Congress, and then a Democratic president with a split Congress, and a Democratic president with a Republican Congress. This source is RBC Capital Markets. You can see that when Republicans sweep it, so they control the White House, the Senate, and the House, there tends to be an average annual return in the S&P since 1933 of 13%. And with a Democratic sweep, it tends to be a little bit less at 9%. But the 3 main scenarios where the stock market does double-digit well, on average, is either a Republican sweep, or a Democratic president with a split Congress, or a Democratic president with a Republican Congress. So all 3 of these scenarios tended to yield, on average, single-digit returns, and those were a Democratic sweep, or a Republican president with a Democratic Congress, and a Republican president with a split Congress. So just to give you an example of various things that could happen, you could use this to anticipate stock returns for that year, on average, recognizing that there could be a lot of statistical uncertainty in that. But just in general speaking, this is what we've seen over the last 90 years or so. So where does this come into Bitcoin? So before the last month, right? So before October, there was actually a pretty strong correlation of Bitcoin with traditional markets, right? This is undeniable. Now I've shown graphs on here before that when we looked at the correlation coefficient of Bitcoin during bear markets to the S&P, there wasn't really a strong correlation one way or another. One year, one bear market had a negative correlation to the S&P, one bear market had a positive correlation, and then one had no correlation at all. So you couldn't necessarily write off a bear market of Bitcoin to the fact that the S&P was either doing poorly or great. It just happened to be that no, Bitcoin went through a bubble, and it was just having that bubble pop. It probably had very little to do with the S&P. In 2020, it seems like there has been a bit of a more correlation to the S&P, and up until October, they were pretty tightly coupled. If you guys remember back when Bitcoin was testing the 20-week moving average over here, let me switch this over to the 20 weeks. So I need to switch this over to 140 days. If you remember when Bitcoin was testing the 20-week, we said, if the stock market takes a huge dump right here, there's a good chance this won't hold. But in fact, it didn't, and it pretty much held steady even with a recent pullback in stocks. It's not a huge it's not like a huge catastrophic drop or anything like that. But recently, Bitcoin has been rallying despite the fact that stocks have been slowly pulling back, but nothing major. So one of the things we can note is, well, what has Bitcoin done so far? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at 2012, 2016, and 2020, the run up to the election, and then what happened just after the election. So in October, so if we measure this as, from October 1st, and okay, what did Bitcoin do starting October 1st until the election? So let's just measure it from October 1st to November 1st. So in October, Bitcoin went up 30%. Okay, so now we're going to go all the way back to 2016 and see what Bitcoin did during 2016. So if you look at October, we take a measured move starting from, so it would be all the way over here, starting October 1st, so right in this area, and we take a measured move, you can see that, so from October 1st to November 1st, Bitcoin went up approximately, 17-18% or so. Okay, so it did pretty well in October, just like it has this year. Now, what happened in November of 2016? Well, if you measure it from, say, November 1st, so right here, to, well, that's October. If we take it from November 1st, so right here, all the way to December 1st, you can see it was maybe a modest 5% move up. And it depends on exactly where you take your reference point. Maybe 5% up, 5 to 6% up. However, there was a period in here where Bitcoin saw a pretty decent retracement. You can see that in 2016, on November 3rd, in fact, from the peak to the bottom, Bitcoin retraced by approximately, 11 to 12% on a single day. But it still continued up over the macro scale, right? It still continued up. This is just a blip if you zoom out, right? Nothing to write home about. So 2016 was a lead up to the election in October. Bitcoin was moving up. During November, it more or less moved sideways with some volatile, with at least one volatile day down 10% or more to the downside. But over the whole month, it still tended to hold up pretty well. And then if we look at 2012, if we go all the way back to 2012, here we are. So if we measure it on a daily time frame, starting from say October 1st, so we're going to go all the way to October 1st, and look to see where it ended on November 1st, you can see that it was approximately a 12% drop or so. And then moving from November 1st to December 1st, the price of Bitcoin actually rallied approximately, 16% or so. Okay, so you can see that both elections so far have had very different trends. Okay, so the first election that Bitcoin was around for was in 2012, and it tended down in October and up in November. The second election was different because what it did was it went, if we go back to October, it went up in October, but it did kind of go sideways through November for the most part and then continue its run in December. So far, the election has not had a huge impact on the price of Bitcoin. However, you could argue that back in 2012, most people didn't know about Bitcoin anyway, so it probably wouldn't really affect the election. In 2016, there were more and more eyes coming to see Bitcoin, but it still wasn't a mainstream thing by any means, and it still isn't. But now it certainly is a lot more interest, right? More institutional investors are coming on board. Even PayPal have started offering it, or they will be offering it as a payment solution. Now, if you look at the present day, Bitcoin has rallied into November. So from October into November, it has rallied. One of the things we want to talk about, of course, is the idea, as we've mentioned before, if you look at the general reaccumulation phase of these different levels, right? So around 10,000 down to 8,600 or so was an accumulation phase, and then if we extend this out, 10,000 became the bottom part of this accumulation phase, and then the top part was around 12,000 or so. So we kind of extended this out. Now, if 14K does end up being the next, local top of an accumulation phase, then it's not that far-fetched to see us maybe come back down. And a situation where this could, somewhat occur is if stocks take a tumble over the next few weeks and Bitcoin decides to react to it. Now, you could argue that Bitcoin, there's no reason it would react to it because it does seem like it's decoupled over the last few weeks, right? Stocks have been trending down, Bitcoin has been trending up. Why would we expect stocks to react? Or why would we expect Bitcoin to react to a drop in stocks? Well, if stocks do drop, and given that Bitcoin is already up, 30% in about a month or so, it's not hard to imagine a scenario where just by natural or happenstance that Bitcoin comes back down to the lower part of this range. I'm not saying it has to, right? I mean, Bitcoin could continue to rally from here and go into a short-term speculative bubble. But if it does come back down, of course, the general narrative will be, well, if stocks are dipping, maybe Bitcoin's dipping too. It's just cooling off for a little bit. But at the end of the day, I think that it's still just kind of stepping stones to the prior all-time high of a sustainable $20,000. And even an election, as publicized as this one, I still don't think will have a huge implication in the short term on exactly what the price of Bitcoin is going to do, right? And we already showed, right, whether the incumbent wins or whether the incumbent loses, historically speaking, stocks on average are down less than 1% over the following week or so, on average. Of course, there's going to be outliers to that. This year could also be an outlier. And I mean, given the pandemic, it's hard to really say, what could we expect? Because if you go back to the first chart, if we go back and look at the very first chart that we showed, historically speaking, when the market was up 6 months out, so 6 months prior, when you see it 6% up, it meant that the incumbent, that was when the incumbent party won. If it was only 1% up, then the incumbent party lost. But if you look 6 months prior, this was right after the crash. So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the stock market is up approximately 12% over the last 6 months. But so that would signify that would fall more into the incumbent party winning. However, over the last 3 months, there's been a slight negative return, just very slight. In fact, it was positive up until like the close of the week last week. But even then, it depends on exactly how the 3 months are measured. Whether it's measured to just say like the end of October, or whether you measure it to the very beginning of on election day. And then 1 month prior, you can see. So I mean, generally speaking, you can see that if the market is doing well leading into the election, then historically speaking, the incumbent party tends to win. Okay, if it's not doing as well, where you're seeing a lower return or negative return over these various time frames, then it tends to mean the incumbent party lost. But no matter who won, the next day or the next week, on average, the stock market dipped. So if the stock market does dip and Bitcoin corrects back to, say, 13,000 or something, which, I mean, is always a possibility, regardless of what stocks are doing, if Bitcoin just were to correct back to, say, 13,000 or even below that to, say, 12.5, 12.3, something like that, you could obviously argue, and people will argue, that it's because, potentially if stocks are dropping, then that's the reason why Bitcoin's cooling off. But at the end of the day, I think it's just a small little blip on the macro trend of Bitcoin, and recognizing that at the end of the day, it's probably not going to have a huge impact over the macro scale. So let me know what you guys think about the content. Remember, if you guys like the content, please subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up. We also have a Telegram channel, which you can find a link to in the description below. And if you want access to the premium list, you can find access to that at intothecryptoverse.com. You get access to a weekly report, a weekly premium video, and a Telegram alerts channel, which is where I put out my candid thoughts on the markets, as well as a risk dashboard, which is what I use to trade crypto. And if you want, you can pay for 12 months and get like a 15% discount. So at the very least, subscribe to the channel, help me get to 50,000 subscribers. I hope you guys enjoyed the analysis, at least in lieu of the upcoming election, which is tomorrow. So we'll follow up on this in a few days, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.